Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week's video focuses on Warhammer 40,000 7th edition. This was the last edition where the codexes from earlier editions were still viable. The 3rd through 7th editions used incremented codexes, where you'd use the most recent codex for a given faction. 7th was the end of this. 8th will be a major rules overhaul that invalidated all the previous codexes. We'll talk about that one next week. 7th edition, though, was a significant departure from the previous editions just through subtleties in the rules that were added. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy as we talk about Warhammer 40,000 7th edition. Before we continue with this video, let me just say, if you like this video and like this topic, please click like and subscribe down below. If you feel that there's something you want me to cover in more detail, feel free to comment, or hey, just tell me what you like or didn't like in the video. I'm always listening for constructive feedback. And so with that, let's continue on into this discussion. One of the first things that one notices with 7th edition is a fundamental change in how it presented the game. None of the previous editions, except for 2nd edition, and at this time, no future edition did things quite this way. You see, 7th edition presented the books in a 3-book box. It was just these 3 books. One book was just the rules. The only pictures of models were to illustrate points in the rulebook. Art was more just to break up the wall of text. The second book in the box set was the setting. This was a history book sort of on, where things came from, all that. It dealt with the rise of the Imperium, a brief overview of it, the rise and fall of the Eldar, orcs, Tyranids, discussion of basically the history and state of the galaxy. And that was really cool. And then the 3rd book was just miniature eye candy. It was a book all about the miniatures and showcasing the various miniatures and showing how to paint them and giving inspiration for how to paint your armies. Which previous editions put all 3 of these books into one book. That was considerably fewer pages, all told, than these 3 books combined. Now, I really liked this method, and I'm kind of disappointed that they did not go back to this with 8th edition. But I can also kind of understand why, just because most people just need the rules. You can, through discussion and all that, learn all about the history, and, not putting it in great detail gives the players a excuse to interact with each other, discuss all this, and, maybe even buy some of their Black Library books. But 7th edition tried this method. And while I liked it, it apparently wasn't popular enough for them to continue with it. From there, we have the next significant change. Previous editions did not really have a psychic phase. Well, after 2nd edition, they did not have a psychic phase. With 7th edition, we had the return of the psychic phase. And it was placed in a different spot than in the 2nd edition. because we still had the same basic the 3 phases. And then Psychic Phase was worked into that. So, we had Movement Phase, Psychic Phase, Shooting Phase, Close Combat Phase. But, there were 2 subtle distinctions. They put 2 more phases, the start of turn and end of turn, because there would now be effects that triggered at the start of turn or at the end of turn. These might not seem like major deals, big things, but these were significant. These actually created the definition that things happened at the start of turn, things happened at the end of turn, and then you had the other 4 phases. Now, in addition to that, there was a significant change to how psychic powers worked. Previous editions, they either just straight up worked, or, like in 2nd and 5th and 6th, the psychic test was based off the leadership of the psyker. Well, 7th edition changed that. And how it changed it was each psychic power had a warp charge. And through various means, you would gain a number of points to spend on dice. And you would roll these dice, and these dice would be the number of warp charges you could conceivably get. The method was you had a random number, 1 dice 6 plus the dice equal to your mastery level of your psychers. So if you had an army that had a lot of psychers, you could conceivably get a lot of dice. You could then, of course, use these dice to counter psychic powers if it was your enemy's turn and not your turn. And, from there you try to get a number of dice to come up a certain number. And the dice that came up this number would count towards generating the charge. There was a baseline number, but some psychers had abilities that let them target a lower number. And some, I believe, had issues where they had to reach a higher number for their warp charges. But that was really a big change. It meant you were now assigning a pool and having to try and guess what you were going to need, because there was another slight caveat. If you rolled too many dice of the same number, that would trigger perils of the warp. Basically, bad things happen to your librarian or psyker. Of course, it wasn't as likely anymore for them to be dragged screaming by a daemon into the warp. Oh man, I missed that from 2nd edition. But it could still theoretically happen. But that was one of the major areas of change. The other change was the initiation of mastery levels, where basically a psyker could know and use a number of psychic powers equal to their mastery level. They had to pick these from the tables and power trees that were available to them, and they had a one power that if they took all their picks from this same tree, they got this additional power free. It was called the Primaris power. But that was the big thing with librarians, with psychers, was this whole, they got a phase that they got to dominate. Some of their powers could influence other phases, but they no longer happened in other phases. You still did everything during the psychic phase. This meant your psyker had to plan out what powers he was going to use during that phase, what powers he was going to risk using, what powers he was going to not use because he needed to get this other power off to buff these guys in the assault phase, or buff them in the shooting phase, or weaken the guys that they were fighting. But those were the big changes right there. The next significant change came with vehicles. Now, on one level, vehicles were still fairly much the same. They still had a whole bunch of weapons, and depending on how far they moved, the type of vehicle and all that, determined how many and of what kind of weapons they could fire. But there was a change. And this big change was a thing called hull points. And what happened is, if you got a glancing hit on a vehicle, which was your roll on the armor pen chance, equaled the vehicle's armor, it just took away one hull point. If you exceeded the armor value, you got a penetrating hit, which did one hull point and a roll on the penetrating hit chart. And the penetrating hit chart did some tweaks so that vehicles didn't explode quite as easily. You see, in the previous editions, a penetrating hit had a 50% chance of removing the vehicle. They changed it to a 1 in 3 chance on a penetrating hit to remove the vehicle from play, which was a significant change. It made vehicles something that they weren't in the previous edition. Survivable. Now, they did a few other significant changes, like different unit types got different statistical benefits. These, could range from jump infantry getting a 12-inch move and then, still having a standard D6 run. Or D6 charge. But when everything is said and done, the single most important change was a change that was done in a single line of text. This single line of text changed everything. Was a clear delineating point from this edition and all previous, and this concept would be held forward for all future editions. This one game-changing, game-shattering change was you could now measure at any time. All the previous editions, you could not pre-measure. You could not know how far you needed to go to make that charge. you could not know how far your opponents were before you fired your guns. You would have to, in all previous editions, declare what you were shooting at, then measure to see if you were within range. 7th edition changed that. You could now measure to see if you were within range with your las cannon of that Chaos Land Raider. You could measure to see if you were within 12 inches of that Chaos Land Raider with your multi-melta. You could measure to see anything. You could see if you were going to be within range after your movement. This changed everything, because no longer was the game about having to be able to guess and gauge accurately ranges like 72 inches, 48, 24, 36 by eyeball. Old-time players like me, we still have that skill. It's not something you lose, but it's still being able to know for certain that you're going to be able to set something up for a perfect charge, or that you're going to be able to move that unit to where it can shoot at the enemy. That changed everything on a fundamental level. And that change would carry over to 8th edition. And hopefully it will carry over to all future editions. So, with that, I will end this discussion. I hope you enjoyed this. Next week, I will be talking about Warhammer 40k 8th edition, and thus, until such time as they come out with 9th edition, we'll end this series on the history of the editions. Until then, I would just like you all to remember to have fun and keep gaming.